Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this inaugural event in the 2014-2015 Chancellor's Colloquium Distinguished Speaker Series. This series now it is in its 6th season and continues to the work of inviting scholars, academic leaders, and policymakers to our campus, who encourage us to take a fresh look at the university as an incubator for ideas and a force for change. Through discussions on the future of the humanities, the role of the research university in the interconnected world, and the challenges facing scientific research in our current economic climate, among other critical issues, the series seeds a vision for the future of our university. We are so very fortunate today to have with us Dr. Hamid Dabashi, the Hagop Kevorkian Professor of Iranian Studies and Comparative Literature at Columbia University in New York. Allow me now to introduce David Biale, the Director of the UC Davis Humanities Institute, and Emmanuel Regenblum, Distinguished Professor of History, who will introduce Dr. Dabashi as well as our moderators for this evening, Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor Raf Hexter, and Associate Professor Ali Anooshahr from the UC Davis History Department. So with that, I would like to ask Professor Biale to come forward. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this conversation with Hamid Dabashi. Our format this evening will begin with opening remarks by Professor Dabashi, entitled Why Persian Humanism Matters Today, followed by a panel discussion with Provost Hexter and Professor Anooshahr. Then the audience will be given an opportunity to ask their own questions of Dr. Dabashi, moderated by Provost Hexter. Allow me first to introduce Provost Hexter and Professor Anooshahr. Ralph Hexter is a distinguished scholar in classics and comparative literature, and as an academic leader, he has made it a priority to foster excellence across the full range of disciplines and to promote equal opportunity, diversity, and inclusion for students, faculty, and staff. Ali Anooshahr arrived at UC Davis in 2008 to teach comparative pre-modern Islamic history with a special focus on Indo-Persian culture. In his recent book, The Ghazi Sultans and the Frontiers of Islam, and many articles, Anooshahr focuses particularly on the transmission of texts and individuals along networks that connected India, Iran, Central Asia, and the Ottoman Empire. I'm now honored to introduce our distinguished guest, Hamid Dabashi. Dr. Dabashi is a founding member of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, as well as a founding member of the Center for Palestine Studies at Columbia University. Dr. Dabashi is the series editor of Literatures and Cultures of the Islamic World for Palgrave Macmillan, a series that brings the study of Islamic literatures and cultures to the wider attention of scholars and students of world literatures and cultures. His recent books include Being a Muslim in the World, published also by Palgrave Macmillan, and Iran, A People Interrupted, published by the New Press. His most recent book, and the one perhaps most relevant to today's talk, is The World of Persian Literary Humanism, which has been hailed as a brilliant study of the Persian perspective on what has sometimes been seen as solely a Western question, namely, what does it mean to be human? Thank you for being with us, Dr. Dabashi. Before Dr. Dabashi comes out to the podium, I'd like to ask everyone to silence or turn off your phones, please. And I now turn the podium over to Dr. Dabashi.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to start by expressing my gratitude to Chancellor Katehi for kindly and graciously and very generously inviting me into this prestigious lecture series, and express publicly my apology that I was supposed to be here last year, but I fell ill and I couldn't. I'm absolutely delighted to be here in your company. And this absolutely extraordinary, magnificent weather that you have, that every Californian that I ever meet, every time that I come to California, this is exactly the weather that I have seen in every single season. But they make a point to tell me it is just today. Before you came was horrible. So you should make a point of inviting me more frequently. I've been given a very generous 15 to 20 minutes to talk about the subject of my most recent book, The World of Persian Literary Humanism, and after which we will have a conversation that I hope you will join us. But very briefly, to give you the genealogy of this book, which is very dear to my heart, it is actually an extended conversation with my dear, beloved, now deceased Professor George Katehi, my professor at University of Pennsylvania when I was a graduate student. George Katehi was a scholar of both scholasticism and humanism in the Arab world. And his interest was a comparative study of both scholasticism and humanism in the Mediterranean context. And despite the fact that his scholarship was mostly on Arab humanism, his interest was in the Mediterranean basin, and most of his comparison was with European, with the Western humanism. And in the course of many conversations that I had with the late George Katehi, he was an exceptionally generous professor, and he took his graduate students, including me, very seriously. He and I had a point of difference and contention. His position was, so far as the Arab humanism was concerned, that the rise of Arab humanism, or adab institution, as we call it, was in deference to the eloquence of the Quran, the holy text of Muslims. Whereas my position was and remains that, yes, of course, the Quran has an exceptionally important significance for Muslims, but eloquence, the language, the eloquence of language becomes a reality sui generis and unto itself. But in the case of Arab humanism, because Arabic language is something that the Quran and the Arab humanists shared, one could make that argument that it has to do with the eloquence or the elevation in which Muslims hold their holy text. But I took that argument more eastward, towards the Persian world, towards Central Asia, towards Iran, towards the greater Khorasan, what today is Afghanistan, and of course, by extension, into India. And I began to study humanism in detail in deference to the work of George Katehi, but also now in conversation, because at this time, I'm now also deeply entrenched in what my colleagues at Comparative Literature are doing at Columbia, with another great scholar who was not my teacher, but was a teacher of a whole generation, namely the distinguished literary theorist Edward Said. In the case of Edward Said, the issue that he grappled with towards the end of one of the epilogues that he wrote to his magnificent, groundbreaking book, Orientalism, was when critiques began to take issue with him so far as what they called residual humanism, that there is a residual humanism in his criticism. And there is a moment of exasperation in that epilogue that Edward Said says, I'm happy there is a residual humanism in my thinking. Orientalism, he says, is a work of advocacy, is not a theoretical machine, which is, of course, a moment of throwing the gauntlet and not really addressing the issue of that, what European philosophers consider to be the crisis of the subject, crisis of humanism in the European context. So the shadow of these two great scholars and thinkers were with me as I began to think about Persian humanism. But I did not. I was just talking to a young journalist. It is very important for you to know that when we turn to Arab humanism or Persian humanism or Indian humanism or Latin American humanism, this is not at the expense of the humanism that was generated, sustained, and has been rich and fulfilling in the European context, from which we also in the US benefit. and have been the product of. In many ways, we are the product of the European humanism. However, European humanism has followed a particular trajectory from the classical Greek into the Roman period, into the Enlightenment and Romanticism, and then in the US in the context of transcendentalism. And it's a world, it's an interrelated world, and the need, especially in this time, especially in a time that every society, every country, every clime seems to be fragmenting along sectarian and identity politics. In fact, to find alternative worlds that have existed and addressed very fundamental issues, such as what it means to be human. And in that context, when you turn to any other kind of humanism, you will find many similarities and you will find many differences. And the point is to recognize those differences, bank on those differences, in order to enrich the global experience of what it means to be human. The best example that I can give you is a 10th century Persian Muslim scholar named Al-Biruni, who with a world-conquering emperor, Sultan Mahmud, went to India and wrote a book on India. It's called Tahqiq Mal al-Hindi, on India, which is available now in English. Early in his book on India, Al-Biruni says, you may wonder, why do I write a book about India? And my answer is that I write a book about India because we don't know anything about Indians. And we so much don't know anything about Indians that when, this is, remember, 10th century, when we want to scare our children, we show them the picture of an Indian. And come to think of it, when Indians want to scare their children, they show a picture of us to their children, from which, before he falls into the trap of relativism, this is the superiority of his intelligence, he says, from which I conclude that there is something in every culture, in every civilization, that has to create an alternative, a difference, in order to define itself. The distinguished Chancellor Katehi is Greek, right? The word barbarian, what does the word barbarian mean? Is a Greek word for those who did not speak Greek. And to the ear of a Greek, those who were speaking other languages appeared as barbarian. And the word that the Arabs have for Iranians, for Persian, was ajam, which means dumb, meaning people who can't speak proper Arabic. And the word that Iranians have for non-Iranians is an-Iran, which literally means not Iranian. So you're either Iranian or not Iranian. So this duality that you create a difference by virtue of which you define yourself has been definitive to the formation of many cultures. It's not peculiar to one or another culture. So what is the task? The task is begin to build beyond this fabricated notion of tradition and modernity. I always say, in fact, tradition is the greatest invention of modernity. Because European modernity didn't know how exactly to define itself, began by inventing tradition. This tradition was either in the past of Europeans or in the presence of non-Europeans. And if we overcome that false, in my opinion, binary, we begin to discover alternative worlds that have existed. And this discovery of alternative worlds is not something new, or is not something that you have to do necessarily in Persian context, or in Arabic context, or in Indian context. Distinguished French historian Ferdinand Braudel, for example, believed in the unity of what he called the Mediterranean basin as a unit of civilizational formation. So, for example, when you hear that perhaps Dante was under the influence of what we call the Mi'raj literature, the ascending of the Prophet Muhammad to heaven, when he was writing his Divine Comedy, Given the Mediterranean domain of influence between the Hebrew, the Arabic, and the Greek and the Spanish, is not much of a leap of faith in that direction. Great Spanish historian, Americo Castro, has a book about the Spaniards and their culture that he wrote in the 50s, in which he begins to carve a notion of the Spanish culture that includes its Jewish and Muslim heritage, that from 711 to 1492, it was the bedrock of a magnificent civilization that includes Christians, Jews, and Muslims that for 700 years gave rise to a major civilization until the period of Reconquista. Ibn Khaldun is another great historian who too began to think of alternative modalities of thinking about civilization in Mediterranean and North African context, entirely independent of this East and West, or the West and the rest. This historicizes the phenomenon called the West. It doesn't dispense with it. For a period, it has been extraordinarily influential, but it modifies it. And as a result, as I was just telling to this young journalist, it does not discredit the West, it decenters the West. Once the West is decentered, we are not crippled from walking, we are actually enabled to fly, because a multidimensionality begins to appear in the factual evidence of our cosmopolitan culture that is always influenced by a varieties of civilizations and cultures and literatures and poetry and so forth. We know for a fact that Xenophon's Cyropedia, a book on Cyrus the Great, was in the library of Thomas Jefferson at the time of the American Revolution. So, and Xenophon's Cyropedia is a text that for a period of time was actually competing with Plato's Republic in terms of significance for state building. The examples are many. Every episode of European history, you will see the presence of non-European cultures, civilizations, literatures, poetry. So what I am arguing in terms of the recognition of alternative worlds that have been in existence and in conversation with non-European cultures is a factual evidence, is not an ideological proposition, is a factual evidence actually concealed by an ideological proposition that there is something unique, unprecedented, and extraordinary, and entirely unto itself about European or Western civilization. It is in that context that then, in my study of Persian humanism, I trace it from multiple, in multiple imperial contexts, and I begin to argue that, in fact, the word Persian has multiple meanings. Initially, when you have the formation of independent dynasties in easternmost part of Islamic Empire against the Umayyad and the Abbasids in the western part of the empire, the emergence of Persian language and thereby Persian literature has a ethnos, has an ethnic element in it. Because the Arabs are proud of their language, and rightly so, Persians begin to boast about their language and their significance and their poetry. But eventually, with the rise of a major easternmost empire, namely the Ghaznavid empires in the late 9th and 10th century, the Ghaznavids were not Iranians, they were not Persian, they were actually Turkic dynasty. By the time of the Ghaznavids in the late 9th and 10th century, when the significant text of Shahnameh is actually produced, Persian has transformed itself from ethnos into logos, namely centrality of language. It doesn't matter who speaks it, so far as the language is spoken. If it's Arab or Persian or Turk, makes no difference. The same continues with the subsequent empires, such as the Seljuqids and ultimately the Mongol Empire, which is the largest empire that ever existed, and its primary language of administration and historiography was in fact Persian. That is, major books on the history of Mongol Empire are actually written in Persian. This I call eventually the transformation of Persian as a logos into ethos, namely the emergence of great Persian poets. Sa'di comes in the 13th century, Rumi comes in the 13th century, when practicing Persian language has nothing to do with your ethnicity, has nothing to do with the centrality of language, but has to do with the ethos that is being transformed. Finally, we come to the three major contemporary empires, the Mughals in India, Safavids in Iran, and the Ottoman Empire. And along these three empires, if we can also include Russian Empire in Central Asia, when we have the transformation of Persian language is traveling from Iran actually to India. And it is in India that Persian language flourishes and becomes a magnificent language of prose and poetry. With the formation of the Safavid in the 16th century, Persian literature ceases by and large and comparatively to be a language of empire for the Safavids. They were now interested in Shiism as a unifying ideology of their empire. And as a result, many Arab Shia scholars from Jabal Amil in Lebanon and Syria begin to go to Isfahan. We have a sort of anecdote about them that they didn't speak a word of Persian. They just got on their donkey and memorized one phrase, Isfahan kujas, where is Isfahan? And they just moved east until they got. So in the 16th century, you have the moving of poets and prose stylists and historians from Iran into India, and that's the export, and the import are theologians, philosophers, jurists who come from Jabal Amil into Safavid domain. Ultimately, my argument is that with the encounter with European imperialism, we have something peculiar happens, and that is the thing that happens, that proverbial Persian poet and prose stylist exits habitually one dynasty, one court, and enters another court. So far as there are patrons and emperors and sultans and shahs who patronize the Persian poets, they have a business. But in the encounter with European colonialism and imperialism, the Persian poet exits the court, but there is no court to go to, because now the courts speak English and Spanish and French and what have you. Here is the moment that what Habermas calls public sphere is created. That's the moment that, for example, young students like Mirza Saleh Shirazi in early 19th century brings the first printing machine to Iran. And he and his generation are responsible for simplification of Persian prose. Persian prose exits the court, enters the public. And with that printing machine, he publishes the first newspaper in Persian. And in fact, he calls it in Persian Kagaz Akhbar, which is the translation of newspaper. The Persian poet enters the public sphere and begins to form and define and constitute that public sphere. And it is in that public sphere that then language and literature and culture begins to its contemporary history. To make a long story short, the significance of Persian humanism or Arabic humanism or Indian humanism today is to provide alternative, existing, experienced, lived, historical worlds that have existed, and knowledge of them does not compromise or negate or dispense with the world that we know, but actually enriches it. Thank you for your patience.
So thank you so much. I'm Ralph Hexter, Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor, and now and then Professor of Classics and Comparative Literature. So it's a great honor to be with fellow comparatists and scholars of earlier forms of literature and culture, which I study and teach. So let me start with a question that's a little bit apart from what you were exactly talking about. But as someone who teaches literatures and cultures of the ancient and medieval world, sometimes when talking to contemporaries, they wonder why I attend to those older forms of cultures. I'm wondering what your answer to that is, or particularly how it is perhaps best framed when you think of the Persian tradition.
First of all, I think that contemporary events and contemporary news, and especially if you're like me on Facebook, every 5 seconds something new is happening, after a while becomes just torturously boring. And turning into, I mean, I really, believe it or not, I consider myself a medievalist, except the periodization, classic, medieval, modern, doesn't really apply to anything. In fact, as you well know, many European historians have started questioning when was it exactly that the period called medieval was invented, invention of Middle Ages, for example. But more importantly, my answer to the question you raised is that yes, I do go to pre-modern period, to the classical period, but I ask modern questions. I ask contemporary questions. Namely, the question of agency, the question of identity, the question of multiple worlds that have existed, the question of the solidity of contemporary geography that we see. We have where is the center of the world? You follow? We have a joke about an idiot savant Persian, his name is Mullah Nasruddin, that somebody asked him, where is the center of the world? He had his donkey, at some point, so right there with my donkey, that's the center of the universe. If you don't believe, go measure it and find out. So this thing that I call decentering ourselves, especially the fact that I'm sure here in Davis as well, at Columbia where I teach, I walk from one end of our campus to another end of our campus and I hear literally 10 different languages. And New York as a cosmopolitan, or San Francisco, or Los Angeles, or Chicago, or London, or Cairo, or etc. These are not exceptions. These are, New York to me today is Baghdad of the 13th century, is Isfahan of the 16th century. The same is with San Francisco. So there is something, I think, both intellectually satisfying, but also, I think, politically pertinent to begin to sort of decenter ourselves and begin to think of alternative worlds that have existed, and knowledge of them will actually enable us to hear and understand our own particular accent. Again, I was just telling this journalist that a couple of years ago I was in Arizona to give a talk, and we were having breakfast with strangers, but in a hotel, and a nice lady turned to me, didn't know me, and asked me, and where do you come from? I said, I come from New York, ma'am. And she said, but I do detect a little bit of accent. I said, yes, ma'am, so do I. But the thing is, you don't hear your own accent. And being exposed to other accents, you do also realize that you too have a little bit of accent.
I like that. Professor Anooshahr, perhaps.
Well, thank you. You know, in your book, you say that you like to look at literary history, but you like to avoid historicism. But as a historian, I can't avoid it. So
very good.
I like to bring some of that in the sense that, you know, I think all of us are products of our own kind of environment. And the questions that we ask are products of specific times and places, as you were saying.
Very good, very good.
And I think, you know, looking at the kind of narrative that you're trying to decenter, which is partially Orientalist to kind of marginalize,
exactly,
but also the Iranian nationalists,
exactly,
to really provincialize,
yeah,
right? This kind of cosmopolitan
exactly,
culture.
Exactly.
It seems to me that we have to kind of know the background of what is this Iranian nationalism. And as we know, it's created basically in the 1920s and 30s by middle-class intellectuals who are anti-royalist. They're afraid of colonialism. They want to be secular. So they posit this perfect nation. The perfect Iranian is an Aryan, right?
True.
Not in
true.
the sense of, I mean, kind of European, but in the sense of secular, right? And that perfect Aryan speaks as Persian, right? And he's secular, and it's not colonized because the Iranian nation has this authenticity and antiquity.
Exactly.
And so it actually has to overlook certain realities of Iran itself.
Exactly.
And I think you have a special perspective on this nationalist narrative based on your experience? Maybe you could share.
Yeah, the thing is that when we do literary historiography, we need to be conscious of the historical context in which these texts are produced. The problem with post-colonial ethno-nationalism, bourgeois ethno-nationalism, is that it always runs into trouble. The ethno-nationalism of Persian, they want Rumi to be an Iranian because he wrote in Persian. Well, he was born in Afghanistan. After the Mongol invasion, he kind of passed through contemporary Iran and lived his life, as you know, in Turkey. So the fact that he spoke Persian or wrote Persian, by and large, contradicts, if we limit ourselves to these fictive frontiers with which we live, the fact that he actually never lived in Iran. Then you say, well, then the thing is that he has to write in Persian, but they want Avicenna. Well, Avicenna lived most of his life in Iran, but he didn't write in Persian. He wrote most of his things in Arabic, because Arabic was the lingua franca of the Islamic civilization. And in fact, he has a book called Danishname Ala'i, his book on philosophy, which is in Persian, and there was a joke at the time that somebody told him, what is this gibberish philosophy you write in Arabic? Would you write one in Persian so we understand? But because the Persian philosophical language at the time of Avicenna was not rich, he said he wrote a book in Persian, but nobody understood what he was talking about. The formation of Persian language as a philosophical language is two generations after that, when Nasiruddin Tusi writes his Asas al-Iqtibas. This is again the same thing with, say, Shahnameh, that they call him a national epic. First of all, epics are products of empires, are not national epic. Then I consider it utterly obscene for an Afghan who lives much closer to Tus, which was the birthplace of Ferdowsi, for Shahnameh not to be his epic, but my epic. And I was born in southern Iran in Ahvaz, much closer to Persian Gulf. So it is by a fictive, post-colonial frontier that then Shahnameh is mine, don't touch it. Afghans, you go away, and Tajiks, you go away. Whereas if you actually look at the map when Ferdowsi was writing the Shahnameh, in the late Samanid and early Ghaznavid period, it is an imperial context. And that imperial map of the Ghaznavids includes Afghanistan, includes Tajikistan, includes Khorasan, and it is in that context that it is produced. So there is no issue that this epic belongs to all of these post-colonial nation formations. The same is with the rise of, for example, Persian in India. When the great literary historian, late Zabihullah Safa, wants to write about 16th century Persian, he says, well, if we want to write the history of Persian literature in the 16th century, we have to go to India. But I apologize to Indians because I really don't mean to interfere in their business, but that's where most of the Persian poets and prose stylists are. But to me, Persian is also an Indian language, just like English under the British Raj became an Indian language. Persian in the 16th century was also a Indian language. So Indians it was not weird for them to write poetry or prose or historiography or works of science or philosophy in Persian. So this is all to say that we need to have a more versatile historical geography in mind, how nations are formed in the aftermath of the collapse of those empires, retrieve those imperial contexts in which they were produced, then write the historiography.
Well, one of the things that I find so exciting as someone who's not, of course, a student of Persian directly, is to read in this account some of the things that one sees elsewhere in the medieval period, something that does not map onto our idea of nation-state, language, literary history. That's one of, as I read you, one of the defining characteristics. But if the Persian language is such an essence, let me ask this question for those of us who don't have direct access. What would you recommend that we read and study if we don't read Persian to get a sense of Persian humanism. And if you tell me that's impossible, I'll
No.
understand.
Actually, it's not impossible. These days, I'm reading with my students every Thursday. I read Ghazali's Nasihatul Muluk, Counsel to the King, in the morning, and in the afternoon, I read Shahnameh. Ferdowsi's Shahnameh is the most glorious Thursday that you can ever imagine. They're both from Khorasan, and I'm in the morning when I get up, I'm ready for Ferdowsi, but then I have to do Ghazali, which is fine, and then do Ferdowsi. There is no single book. I mean, as you know, Rumi is translated into English, and is the most successful American poet right now is actually Persian, and it's perfectly fine. But right now, because I'm teaching Ferdowsi and Shahnameh, there is no single book that I can recommend more highly, because it is so exquisite, it is so magnificent, it is so human, it is so contemporary that I mean, I will not hesitate to tell. There are times in class that I start crying, but I have to control myself. Aging professor, you have to behave properly. Otherwise, Lee Bollinger would be on my case. I'll give you one specific example. There are many examples. There is a case of a magnificent story in Shahnameh, Rustam and Isfandiar. Rustam is the hero, and Rustam and Sohrab. Sohrab is his son, but he didn't know his son. He had a one-night stand somewhere, and this magnificent son is born. The son comes to discover his father and know his father, and unbeknownst to themselves, they get into a battle. And Rustam ends up killing his own son. This is the reverse of Oedipal in Persian literature. But as Ferdowsi describes the battle between Rustam and Sohrab, there is a scene that he has drawn. Rustam has drawn his dagger and is about to bring it down and kill Sohrab instantly. That Ferdowsi freezes the scene, just puts it on the wide screen and looks at it and begins to talk to you as the reader and says, birds in the sky know their children. Fish in the sea know their children. Animals in the wilderness know their children. How could this man not recognize his own son? And then there is one hemistich. از آن دو یکی را نجنبید مهر. None of them, his heart, his kindness didn't tickle him for him to recognize that he's about to kill his own son. So he freezes the mise-en-scène cinematically is just exquisite. I have compared it with Kurosawa's doing of Shakespeare Long. And then he kind of drops that scene and goes back and tells the rest of the story. These moments are abundant practically in every story of Shahnameh. So my recommendation, and the best translation, is the great British poet Dick Davis. Dick Davis' translation, available readily, paperback, so go and read it and enjoy.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Well, I feel like we're on a pendulum here. You speak more general and I speak more
specific.
It's
good. It depends on which one of my glasses I drink.
That's your water. Yeah. And I have a sickness, so you better buy it. So if it's okay, I'd like to ask specific questions about the book. I noticed that, I totally applaud your attempt to take Persian literature out of its sort of provincialized sort of Iranian nationalist account and make it what it was, a kind of a global phenomenon, similar to Greek paideia or the Romanitas of the Romans, right? And it does have a cultural ideal in Sana Kamel, so to create a perfect human. But I noticed that in the narrative that you use, you follow the kind of narrative model established by sort of early 20th century scholars,
True.
Arab conquest
True.
stuff, and then you kind of lead, this is Edward Brown's kind of dynastic notion.
Yeah.
And when we do that, do you think that actually, does that liberate us enough from that Nash? Because the way they had to ignore a lot of things to make Iran a modern Iran direct descendant of the Sasanians and that language.
True.
So do you think maybe there is a way to critically engage even the narrative
Absolutely.
itself so that
Absolutely.
we don't,
Absolutely. To be more precise, I didn't follow a dynastic, I followed an imperial. I went after empires. That is, I defined an empire: the Ghaznavids, the Seljuqids, the Mughals, the Ilkhanids, etc. And then, for example, when I in the fifth, sixth chapter, when I engage the Mughals and the Safavids and the Ottomans, I spend an inordinate amount of time in Central Asia. The reason for that is that there was a magnificent poet in India, his name was Biale, who generated a literary poetic movement in Central Asia called Bidelism, that Soviet scholars and Russian scholars and Tajik scholars have done a lot of work on that particular movement. But that I give you as an example that it was not dynastic. This was drawn actually by the literary development. That's one thing. The other thing is that I differ. E.G. Browne, early in his magnificent 4 volumes that all of us are very indebted to him, but I'm fundamentally in disagreement with him, is that he's going to create a literary history for Persians. Whereas Persian for me is a floating signifier. You follow? And I document the fact that some of the earliest Persian poets were actually Arabs, were not Iranian. But it doesn't matter because we're talking about within the imperial context. Having said that, I think your point is perfectly legitimate, that the actual teleology also needs to be broken. But my sense is that to break that teleology, which is a necessary and legitimate project, at least in my field, what I do, I'm more fascinated by the nature of literary, what is literary, as a literary scholar, rather than a historian. So I didn't, to make a long story short, I didn't want to shake too many boats at the same time. I wanted to have some people sort of having some firm feet on the ground as I'm doing my thing, which, dear old friend of mine, Mahmoud Omid Salar, he and I, he's my oldest friend in US. He's also a literary historian, very opinionated, nationalist historiographer, as you well know. But he has a generosity of spirit. When he read my book, he has completely reformulated his notion of historiography based on my book, and began to read, because he writes profusely for literary encyclopedias inside Iran, in Persian. I don't write in Persian. That is influenced by that. Yeah. But you have absolutely a good point.
One of the things that I have the feeling that you're definitely writing for those of us who don't have access to a large degree, and so you describe the subversive nature, the potential for subversion by using the Trojan horse. I have to say, as a classicist, I love all these references. Could you talk a little bit more about how that functions? And I'm wondering whether there is...
What functions?
How Persian literature as a Trojan horse, or Persian humanism as a Trojan horse functions, and is there any kind of term or image in Persian that is the equivalent of Trojan horse?
No, when I use the metaphor, this is what I meant, that the metaphor of Trojan horse is now part of my thinking. It has to do nothing with my literacy in classical Greek. It has to do with watching too many movies about, Homer and Trojan horse. But how I use it, the reason that I use it is the fact that, despite the fact that initially Persian literary tradition emerges in juxtaposition in what we call the Shu'ubiyya movement against the Arab tribalism, itself becomes an imperial language. But as it becomes an imperial language, there are subversive elements within Persian literary humanism that, in fact, dismantle that serving of the imperial purpose. The best example that I can offer is actually the history of how Ferdowsi, as a poet, comes to the court of the Ghaznavids. I don't know if you have a copy of the cover of my book that you could show. There's a famous painting in the so-called Hotn Shahnameh, of the encounter of Ferdowsi as a poet with 3 court poets. In the painting, which if you have a copy of my book, you see it is the cover of the book. In this painting is a famous story. The painting tells a famous story. And the story is the best example of what I mean by Trojan horse. The story is that 3 court poets, very prominent, lofty, accomplished, rich court poets, Farrokhi, Unsuri, Asjadi, are sitting in a royal garden and having a picnic. And we see in the painting that there are servants and cupbearers and serving them and so forth. And enters a ruffian, okay, not properly dressed, not properly attired, and so forth, and turns to them and says that the 3 great poets, may I join you? And they look at him. He doesn't kind of look appropriately dressed. They said, well, but they want to be polite. They say to him, you know, we are great poets. And we are engaged in what in Persian Arabic we call mushaira. We exchange poems. So how about if we come with a quatrain? We 3 will compose 3 hemistichs of the quatrain, and if you're really a poet, you come with the 4th quatrain, hemistich. And if you do, we know that you're a great poet, and you can join us, have kebab and wine. But they're nasty, and they deliberately decide on a rhyming word that they are absolutely sure there are only 3 words in Persian. So he can't come with the 4th hemistich. So the first one says, Chon arez to mah nabashad roshan. They opt for this shan rhyme. Even moon is not as luminous as your face. The second one says, Hamchun rocheto gol nabavad dar gulshan. Shan, no? Roshan, gulshan. There is no flower in the flower bed as beautiful as your face. The third one says, Mujgant hami guzar konad az joshan. Your eyelashes are so tall that they pierce through an armor. So they have used Roshan, Gulshan, and Joshan. They're absolutely sure there is no other word in Persian vocabulary that ends with the same thing. But Ferdowsi, without missing a bit, says, Hamchun senan giv dar jang pashan. Just like the dagger of Giv in the battle with Pashan. And they say, well, who is Pashan? I say, well, can I join you first? Then I'll tell you who is Pashan. Because he has spent 30 years collecting stories that these fat poets at the court didn't know anything about. He had been traveling throughout Khorasan, reading books, talking to old poets, etc., and comes as a repository of these magnificent stories that these, full professors at the court didn't know much about. So as a result, the book is composed as Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, right? And it has actually been used as a paraphernalia of power and legitimacy. The writing of Shahnameh, the illustration of Shahnameh, the calligraphy of Shahnameh, the recitation of Shahnameh, all used as, for example, the famous Hotn Shahnameh. It was ordered by Shah Tahmasp, we also call it Safavid king, and sent to Sultan Salim as a gift. And how magnificent this Shahnameh is an indication of look how powerful, rich, and so if this is my Shahnameh, you can imagine my army. So this is the kind of a gift that it is. But when you actually read the stories of Shahnameh and variations on the stories of Shahnameh, it is full of Trojan horses, namely subversive elements that can actually, catapult the intention. This is what I mean.
So we toss the baton back to you.
Okay.
And for one last question before we open it to the audience.
I guess just maybe a broad question. I remember in your book you mentioned that it seems to me you were mentioning, first initially give a history of Western humanism, and then you list a number of critiques of Western humanism, and then you come to Persian humanism, perhaps not as an alternative, but as another kind of set that in some ways is already not perhaps immune to, right? But it seems to answer some of the issues that the critique of Western humanism has in Persian, right?
You're a good reader.
Thank you. So, you know, and there's a number of things that you mentioned, and I wonder if you could kind of speak to that. Should we really evaluate Western humanism, Persian humanism, based on internal dialectics and dialogues that are still Western? Are we not still sort of evaluating it based on those categories that are derived from Western humanism?
Again, excellent question. My immediate answer is no. Namely, I have come with these 4 categories that I mentioned. Ethnos, logos, ethos, and chaos, based on my reading of this history. And for each one of them, because they rhyme in Latin, and I give a Persian version of them, but in Persian they don't rhyme. But the fact is, Ali, that you and I, all of us, I am a product of these institutions. Do you follow? And this book could only be written in English. And the fact that, 2 magnificent scholars, Philip Reeve and George Mackesy, were my grandparents, as it were. I don't deny it, I don't conceal it. This is, after all, English and imperial language. You follow? If you and I break into Persian, we will lose the audience. And this, not only in this city, if you go to Europe, if you go to Russia, if you go to Africa, if you go to Latin America, next week I'll be giving a lecture in Mexico. I always tell them, begin by saying, sorry, I don't know Spanish, I speak the other colonial language. That's, it's a historical fact. There was a time that Persian was an imperial language, that magnificent books of science and poetry and prose and so forth were produced in that imperial language, and now it's produced in, so it is inevitable that some of the conceptual and philosophical and theoretical issues that are articulated in this language, I carry them when I move into that domain. And also remember that I'm part of a conversation with Gayatri Spivak and Franco Moretti and, David Damrosch and all of these comparatists. We're friends, we're colleagues, and we're talking about this issue. Some of this dialogue with my colleagues are obvious. Some of it is hidden. But again, it has to do with the existential reality of who I am and what I do. So there are some, the famous expression of blindness and insight. Certain blindness is required for you in order to have an insight. I mean, it's a biological fact, these lenses that enable me to see, they also distort at the same time. That's the paradox. That is, reality is this, and I can't see you properly. I have to distort you in order to see you, in order to make my sight 20/20. So lenses, theoretical frameworks, historical analogies, etc. These are a set of paradoxes that enable insight by creating blind spots.
Well, you've given us the image of the 3 sitting together.
That's right.
I'm not going to say that our audience is a ruffian, but why doesn't the audience complete the quatrain perfectly by asking you a question? We have mics down near the front of the 2 aisles. I think we have a question over there, please.
Great, yeah. I actually have 2 questions. One is a little more relevant.
Ask the second one first.
The second one first. I think you might like the first one first. Okay. 2 questions. So I understand a little bit about the richness of the Persian culture, in fact, the whole Middle Eastern culture. And one question is, why has it gotten so forgotten in terms of Western civilization? But the other question is, that you may not like, and you could ignore if you want, is that I'm puzzled. I'm thinking of Iran, and you see 2 different images. You see the the modern youth, you know, the young, very modern youth with their iPhones and everything, and then you have the very more conservative religious. And I'm wondering if you'd care to comment about the whole Islam and where it's going. And then the third question is the meaning of life, if you'd care to elaborate.
Only 2 to a customer.
These are all important questions. The first one regarding our illiteracy of not knowing as much as we did, I think is a general function of this monstrosity we all carry and the short attention span, that we no longer read books, we read Facebooks. So it's general, it's not specific about Iran. Second is the rapidity, as I said earlier, rapidity of news and 24/7 news production, and this saccharine, instant satisfaction that, you know, the logic that what bleeds leads. So as a result, what monstrosity of some happens in Syria or in Iraq, etc., that becomes more compelling than the fact that Syria is one of the most magnificent cosmopolitan cities, Damascus. Anybody who has been to Damascus knows that it is one of the, not forget about its history and its rich civilization today, as a city, as with its professors and journalists and artists and so forth. But then you think of Syria, you think of this president or that monstrosity and so forth. The same is, so it is more generic rather than specific to Iran or Persian literature. The second part, apropos the distinction that you said, you know, in Iran, that we can't make that distinction that if you're young and hip and have access to the internet, then you're good and splendid and wonderful. But if you are bearded like me and have a turban on your head or something like that, then you are not. That's a false binary, in my opinion. You have to break that binary and begin to see that Iran is going through very traumatic period. And there are caring, loving, attentive people, as you see, for example, in figures like Montazeri or Khatami, etc., among the clerical class. And there are also the opposite of it. Where Islam is going, I mean, in my books I've written a lot about where Islam is going. Islam is in search of its interlocutor, in my opinion. Islam is a dialogical civilization. Islamic theology developed in conversation with Jewish theology. Islamic mysticism emerged in dialogue with Indian mysticism. Islamic philosophy emerged in dialogue with Greek philosophy. And then suddenly, over the last 200 years, Islam became this contestation with European imperialism and turned itself into an ideology of contestation. But I always say, in one of my books, I argue that the collapse of the Twin Towers is also collapse of the binary of Islam and the West, that we are free to rediscover as Muslims or non-Muslims, makes no difference. So I'm not that much, in fact, I mean, I'm concerned about the consequence of Islamophobia, but I think it's a passing stage that people, whether Muslim or Jews or Christians or atheists or God bless them, there is a transformative age we're living. And Muslims, as a result, as 1.5 plus Muslims, are in search of, and they haven't found yet, the interlocutor. With whom are they talking? What that nature of that interlocution will determine the face of, and Bill Maher is not that interlocutor.
Mm-hmm. Sir.
You mentioned in your presentation about Dante and the Islamic influence, the Mi'raj. Can you say a little bit more about it? But also a related question, what about the Persian influence on this writer who supposedly created the Italian language?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the argument is not mine. A magnificent Spanish scholar, Miguel Asín Palacios, 1900, wrote an essay in which he argued the influence of the Mi'raj literature on Dante. And I always say, half facetiously, that what Dante did to Muhammad and Ali in the lower depth of hell was suppressing his footnotes, you know. But again, if you go with Ferdinand Brudel's argument, namely the legitimacy and veracity of Mediterranean culture, do you follow? There's nothing unusual. Especially the link that Miguel Asín Palacios was in fact the Hebrew connection, the Jewish scholarship connection. Shlomo Pinnis also argued. And again, if you look at a great Jewish philosopher like Maimonides, Dalalatul Ha'irin, the Guide to the Perplexed, what language did he write his Dalalatul Ha'irin? He didn't write it in Hebrew, he wrote it in Arabic. Why? Because he was the lingua franca, he was Averroes, and he was in conversation with them. And he is the greatest scholar of Jewish law. He is the codifier of Jewish law. This is not strange, this is not unusual, because if you look at the Mediterranean and the navigational routes in the thing, it is perfectly plausible that in fact, the way that Miguel Asín Palacios and later on a Polish scholar, Białowski, they proposed the idea that perhaps Dante was influenced by that literature. They have posed it far more cautiously than the, you know, Dantologist's refusal. Don't touch, no Arab come near Dante. You know, it is plausible that it had. But we have an older tradition than Mi'raj, as you know, from Zoroastrianism, of ascent to the seventh heaven, that could have also been influential. But influence doesn't detract from Dante's genius of what he did in Divine Comedy. So it is possible.
Well, while perhaps someone else is coming up, you're talking about Dante's potential influence from the Persian tradition, the Arabic tradition. You know, I think of one of the, you know, I think as a comparatist, I'm sort of embarrassed that I don't have the direct access to Persian, but of course, we comparatists are always dealing in translations, and we know their treacheries. But you know, I think of Goethe's Westöstlicher Divan and the way it's based on Hafiz, whom we only knew through translation. You know, so you were very generous in recommending a translation of Ferdowsi. Is Persian? Can you just talk briefly about the translatability of Persian poetry?
As you know, poetry is like music. Can you translate Beethoven's Fifth?
Don't need to.
Well, the thing is that you lose things. To this day, when I teach, for example, Ferdowsi, I can't read translation. I come with rashes. So my student read the translation, wonderful translation of Dick Davis that all Persianists are indebted to. Then when I come to a critical point that I'm really excited by it, I ask my students, what did Dick Davis did with it? So let me see what, and invariably I'm unhappy with what poor Dick Davis did. Not that I can do better, but it just simply doesn't do it. But having said that, because of the sound, because of the, you know, there is a scene in, I think is in Battle of Rostam and Esfandiar, that Ferdowsi plays with sound effects. Sutun kard, chap ra و kham kard, rast. You don't have to know Persian. ستون کرد چپ را و خم کرد راست خروش از خم چرخ چاچی بخواست. He is imitating the sort of pulling of the arrow in the bow. That's he's making the sound of that gesture. So what can you do that? You have to be human. However, I have found. I mean, look. What is the most successful? In fact, I think. Westöstlicher Divan is inspired by Hafiz. Goethe was doing his own thing. Whereas another great translation, namely Fitzgerald's translation of Omar Khayyam, that had to do with the repressed homosexuality of Fitzgerald and the fact that probably he loved his initial Persian teacher who became married and left for India. it's just extraordinary as a poetry, but it is also exquisitely close to the original, what Khayyam was doing. And so there are, so far as Hafez is concerned, Gertrude Bell's translation of Hafez I find beautiful and compelling. Dick Davis has also done some translation of Hafez as well that are fairly accessible. But you know, fortunately, we are in a university. Namely, you can sit down and somebody speaks Greek, somebody speaks Persian, Arabic, you know, all of that. And this magnificent institutions, as I get old and as I am the result of these institutions, I become very conscious of the fact that these are the last havens of our civilization and they need to be protected. And I'm going to pitch for the great Chancellor. We academics need support of the community, but we don't want them to interfere with what we do. We are very peculiar. You have to trust that what we do is good and is for the benefit of all. So do take out your checks and write your contribution, but don't send an email to Chancellor and tell her what to do or not to do.
Yes.
I really enjoyed your presentation. You talked today about decentering the West, and by extension, decentering Iran in terms of the way we think about humanism and other cultures. And in your book, you talked about adab, or roughly literary expression, and I'm open to whatever translation you choose to work with, but adab and literary expression as resisting claims that anybody might make on it, and you know, implicitly rulers and the government, I think, is what you had in mind, although there are other possibilities. And I was wondering if you could speak to the relationship between this literary expression and resisting the claims that might be made on it, and decentering with respect to other cultures.
If I understand your point correctly, my proposal is that within the literary tradition, within adab, which, as you know, it means both propriety, etiquette, and proper attire, and proper speaking manners and diction and all of that. Within it, there is enough subversive elements that enable both the possibility of power-mongering abuse of that as the instrument of power, and the subversion of power. Depends on what part and how you do it. That is, you can create tyranny by virtue of the court poet, because one function of the rhyme and rhythm was how beautifully you praise the king, the sultan, and the more beautifully you praise the sultan, the more widespread became your poem. And as a result, the more legitimate the power that. But at the same time, in every single poet, Nasir Khosrow, Ferdowsi, even the poems that are attributed to these great poets, if afterwards, I'm very interested in this apocryphal, that you put words in the mouth of these great poets. What do you attribute to them? And there are, as you know, in the case of Ferdowsi, there are many satires of Sultan Mahmud attributed to Ferdowsi. But again, if you read Golestan of Saadi, is full of criticism of tyrant and just rulers. So both are possible. And the fact that history of Persian-speaking communities, countries, states, empires, etc., you have had occasions both to use poetry and prose stylists and historians and so forth in order to legitimize the status quo, and the other way around. It is both within the possibilities of what I Adami, Adamiyat, and literary as literary humanism. I hope it partially addresses.
Thank you so much for your presentation. When I teach about Ottoman history and Middle East, during history. One of the things I assigned to decenter European humanism is a piece that talks about the humanists in the late Middle Ages, the Crusader humanists, who apply the juxtaposition, the opposition between barbarian and civilized to Muslim, Christian, and the author makes an argument about how that later develops into perhaps the justification of colonialism. Do you see anything similar in Persian humanism? How is the relationship between, let's say, Iran and Turan? Does it ever get applied to contemporary affairs? And if it does, is Iran and Turan the same way as barbarian or civilized, or is it a little different?
It's different because remember, for example, when Siavash in Shahnameh, when he has an issue with his father, his stepmother accuses him of having made a pass at him. Siavash goes to Turan. So you have many positive characters in Turan. You also have positive characters in the story of Zahak, who is a Tazi, who is an Arab. And many passages in Ferdowsi, in fact, in the case of Zahak, who was a Tazi, was an Arab, we have the first case of Persian Oedipal, because there is a scene that Ferdowsi says that Iblis, Satan, appears as a chef to Zahak and teaches him how to make food, especially meat, makes him carnivorous, and then eventually convinces him to kill his father and become the king. And Ferdowsi again steps out of the narrative and says, no son, no lion, no creature, no animal will kill his father, except if پژوهنده را راز با مادر است. If he has a shenanigan with his mother. پژوهنده را راز با مادر است. We have a very specific case. So again, sympathy, Ferdowsi's sympathy is with Zahak's father, and why did he kill his father? So there are many positive characters, etc., in both Turan and Thing. However, in the case of Tazis, however, in the kind of nationalism that Ali was referring to, namely the transformation of Shahnameh into this, ultra-Persian chauvinism, then Turans are identified with the Turks, and there is a nasty anti-Turkish chauvinism, racism that was developed under this kind of reading, whereas my suggestion is that, in fact, close reading of Shahnameh disallows that kind of identification and racialization of from Shahnameh into the external world.
Please.
Thank you very much. So during your speech, you made a great point, by saying that after the arrival of the Europeans, the court poets and the prose writer, all of them kind of lost their job and they opened up to the public. I wonder if you can talk about the challenges that opening up brought to the language.
Very good.
For example, within that discourse of the discourses on ideologies that the Europeans brought, in terms of the nationalism, for example, the word Vatan or Millat took a really different meaning.
True.
If you can talk about that a little.
Excellent. You see, we have a wonderful point. We have a great poet of the constitutional period. His name is Arif Ghazvini. I mean, definitive to the constitutional revolution. And he has a point in which he says, before my poetry, not 1 out of 10 Iranians knew what Vatan is. Vatan means nation, people. And he's absolutely right, because he invented it. He invented the word Vatan, as my argument is, towards the end of this book, that Vatan is the simulacrum of public sphere. That is, they create the public sphere that they go to, and they begin to define it, cultivate it, constitute it, and belong to it, because it is from here that now they can talk. Language is simplified. Printing machine is brought into the play. Newspapers are published. I mean, you know, the whole accoutrement of public sphere. All in the 19th century, beginning with early 19th century with Mirza Saleh Shirazi, who went to England and sold his paisley shawl and bought a second-hand printing machine to bring back to Iran. So from that point forward, we have a systematic, what we call simplification of Persian prose. What does that mean, simplification of prose? It means bringing it out of the court. You don't have to sort of start 3.5 lines of praising the king before you mention his name. You don't need that, because that scenario has changed. Institutional, many wonderful scholars, Firuze Kashani Sabet is one of them, you know, a number of them have talked about the formation of this public sphere. I mean, the rise of nationalism and what it meant, but my argument is that this nationalism predicated on the word Vatan, this Vatan is public sphere, is Habermas's notion of a public sphere, bourgeois public sphere, that begins to be cultivated by these poets and then comes to fruition in the course of the Constitutional Revolution of 1906, 1911, and as a result, sort of ahistorical, a claim that later Shi'i historians, clerical historians have on the Constitutional Revolution, that no, this was an Islamic revolution or the mullahs led it, is patently false. It's simply not true. Because you have had 100 years of a simplification of Persian prose, articulation of the public sphere, etc., that ultimately comes to fruition in the Constitutional Revolution.
Adam.
A question about, for all three of you, I guess, about what do you feel the impact of the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire may have been on the final meeting of the Persicate and the Latinate worlds. I'm thinking of a world of the early 16th century in which you could have one of the last Latin epics, Merolic's Davidash, being written in Latin on the Dalmatian coast, and a couple miles away in Focha, the first commentaries on Bolistan and Montefilatar are being written in Persian, in what's now Bosnia.
Yeah, exactly.
Just your thoughts on the impact of these two worlds in the early modern period. Thanks.
Well, one of the things that I think we're only beginning to understand is how much actual learning of other languages there was in the Latin West. For the longest of times, we had that orthodoxy is that in the Latin West no one knew Greek. Walter Berschin and now others have shown that there is, through that period, though very localized. That's one of the things that's so different about that world, is local studies in Greek in the West, in Arabic, in Hebrew. I actually don't know very much about studies of Persian in that period, but we're beginning to piece that together. And I'm, fascinated. Those Neo-Latin epics are quite interesting, and very few people are starting to work on it. But, that would be an exciting thing to think about as you're describing really the polyglot nature of that Dalmatian world. I mean, the Ottoman Empire, after powers tend to fall back. There is more mixing there than the nationalist narrative wants to acknowledge, and it's an exciting area for comparatives to study.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't have much to say. I don't know if Baki is still here, our Ottomanist colleague, but he was just writing on Ibrahim Mutafarriqa, who is, I think, is a little bit later period, but he's a Hungarian who actually knows Latin and then writes in Ottoman Turkish and Persian. And it's, that period is also when you get these dictionaries produced in Vienna, Zenker and people like that. So yeah, I don't know much about that research, but it's a very good question how that kind of brings people together.
Yeah, the immediate context of it is the Ottoman Empire. And if I were to choose one genre, it would be Alexander Romance, which was, even in the context of the Ottoman Empire, was composed in Persian, because the tradition of the Alexander Romance that from Ferdowsi and Nizami, etc., had, and all the way down to Jami, which brings us to the Timurid period in contemporary Afghanistan. And a key figure is Amir Ali Shir Navai, who composed poetry in Persian and Turkic, that later on becomes influential in the formation of the Ottoman Turkish. But I think a key genre is Alexander Romance that connects all of these together and brings it to the Dalmatian period.
I think she was.
Oh, let's go there.
So the first book of yours that I read was Theology of Discontent, which was foundational for me. I was wondering if you could put your current work in conversation with that a little bit. You touched on it a little in one of your answers to one of the questions, but if you could talk about the role of materialism in Persian humanism, and then to bring it sort of to the contemporary context, how that showed up. The dialogue between materialism and humanism showed up in the revolutionary movement, not necessarily in the rise of the Islamic Republic, but in the movement that led to...
Would you mind telling me exactly what you mean by materialism?
Well, I'm not going to say Marxism because it's pre-Marxist, right?
Okay.
But I would say economic concerns, economic justice, things like that.
Excellent.
But if in the context of the revolution, I mean Marxism.
Yeah, very good. Listen, when I was writing Theology of Discontent, please sit. I'll be more comfortable if you sit, and can think and talk. The fact is that intellectually, politically, to follow, I had no idea of who these Islamists were. I mean, I was a product of a different political genealogy. When I was an undergrad in Tehran, I lived with all people who thought like me. We were all Marxists. We were all, followers of Cherikhay Fadaykhal and that sort of thing. And we had one roommate who was devout supporter of Shariati. And he said, you have to read Shariati. I even remember the first book that he gave me was a book called Pedar Madar Man Mutahamim. Mother, father, we are responsible, and so forth. And he took me to Hosseini Ershad to listen to Shariati. And I listened to Shariati, and I remember it, and I now confess it as an element of shame. We looked at Marxist, Islamist intellectuals like Shariati like a cousin of ours who has come recently from village, kind of understands the way we speak, we city dwellers, but not quite like us. So when the revolution happened, the whole Theology of Discontent is my attempt to sit down for almost 10 years, pay penance for what I didn't know, and read all of these thinkers very closely. And I remember when I finished my book, we gave it to Oxford. Oxford University Press wanted it, but they said it's too long, we have to cut it. I knew that after this generation, nobody has the patience to sit down and read so much gibberish from which to make sense and create a narrative. So I said no, and then we gave it to NYU Press. That book, as I said, is an attempt by somebody who is not the product of that kind of thinking, but try to understand that thinking. The result was this conclusion that, in fact, Iran was a specific site of the formation of three simultaneous ideological narratives. One was anti-colonial nationalism, best represented by Mossadegh. One was third world socialism, initially represented by Tudeh, then subsequently by Cherikhay Fadaykhal, and by militant Islamism that culminated in the figure of Khomeini. Now, in terms of your point about connected to my later work, it was at the conclusion of that book that I realized all of the major interlocutor of these three formation is European colonialism and colonial presence, that you're talking back to them in one particular language or another. This led me to the centrality of the metaphor of the West as the principal interlocutor. And as I say at the end of my book, Post-Orientalism, that you may have seen, the last chapter is called Changing the Interlocutor. And I say in that chapter that you cannot be more eloquent and more persuasive than Edward Said in terms of talking back to this interlocutor. But he died conversing with a fictive white male in his mind that he was trying to convince that Palestinians have been wronged. And he died unconvinced that he had convinced that fictive white male in his brain that Palestinians have been wronged. So my conclusion was we simply have to change the interlocutor. And I always use the example of that magnificent scene in Taxi Driver, Scorsese's. Are you talking to me? Talking to me? I'm not talking to you. So the changing of the interlocution, I think, is critical in what sort of knowledge do you produce. And I think that this particular book of Persian literary humanism would not have been possible with, of course, the legitimate point that Ali raises, if my generation after Edward Said were not able to liberate ourselves from that forced conversation, trying to convince. I mean, there's a great film by a wonderful Canadian filmmaker, Atem Egoyan, Ararat, you may have seen it, that there is this young Armenian in a Canadian airport trying to convince this homophobic custom officer, Canadian custom officer, that Armenian genocide actually happened. And unless he confirms right there and there in the airport that yes, Armenian genocide happened, as if Armenian genocide didn't happen. This dialogical is important. In terms of materialism, what you call materialism or Marxism or socialism, it's sideways. That is, for example, if you take a figure like Taleghani's economics is entirely socialist economics, but he didn't bring it directly from the sources, but in conversation, sideways conversation with the left, the Marxist left. The problem that contemporary regime in Iran has, the fact of that multifaceted cosmopolitanism, 3 different brands, they have tried to silence it and deny it by mass execution in prisons, university purges, cultural revolutions, one after the other, and they have catastrophically failed, as you know, because that comes from the body of a rich, effervescent, multifaceted, cosmopolitan political culture. And you can't just deny it, pronounce it didn't exist, and so forth. I can give you many examples, especially with the iconography of the revolution. Sort of non-Islamist aspects of the revolution, but I think you get the point.
I think we had one last question on deck, and then I know David wants to say his final words.
Okay, you were talking about in the history that all the maps have changed and how the undercurrent of culture and literature has been going through and changing with all these changes. Now with colonialism, with globalization, how do you see that change, especially with Facebook and all this media that we have? Also, with the mass immigration of people from Iran, third world countries, and interconnection of all these cultures, how does it change, and how would it change the literature in the future? Both ways.
Please. Oh. No, this is this modern technology and social networking and process of globalization. First of all, I think we have to put it into perspective. Globalization, namely over the last 500 years, capital chasing after cheap labor dodging and chasing after capital. 300 million human beings are circumambulating around the globe in search of a job today. So the logic of it is capital wants cheap labor and cheap raw material and expansive market. That's how this system works. This has always been the case. I always say when Adam Smith wrote Wealth of Nation, wealth was not national. Wealth was already transnational, because the logic of capital, as Weber said, Imperialism is predatory capitalism. That's what it is. So the logic of it was in search of market and raw material and cheap labor, etc. Now, what you see today is it is exacerbated. You follow? You have there used to be the flow of labor in search of capital coming from Africa, coming to Europe, for example, or Latin America coming to US. But again, the logic of capital is such that when strawberries are about to rot in California, you need cheap labor. You may pass legislation against so-called illegal immigration, but when farmers need cheap labor comes. But more recently, if you look at the indignato movement, labor unrest and student unrest from Greece to Spain, the Portuguese prime minister told the Portuguese, if you can't find a job in Portugal, go to Angola and Brazil. So the movement is actually circumambulatory. It's not south to north, it's also north to south. If you go to Persian Gulf area, there are so-called expats, Americans, Europeans, all in this rich emirates in the Persian Gulf. So globalization as a result is the exacerbating of that logic of capital, cheap labor, and expansive market. Yes, it will produce different kinds of literatures, different kinds of, right now, you have major novelists, Arab novelists, Iranian novelists, Indian novelists. Look at Salman Rushdie. What is Salman Rushdie? I mean, producing in English for a global market, right? And the same is with Egyptian writers or Iranian writers, etc. They produce for a market that is already globalized, but there is also resistance to it. That there are people who are, Van Diego, for example, Ngugi was one of them, to deliberately abandon writing in English in favor of his own African language. But then he returned. So it's a period of flux that produces its own kind of precarious literature. But despite the fact that it is precarious, because it speaks to the reality of a changing world, I think it's significant. But as you said, the reality of these gadgets and false satisfaction that it generates in terms of knowing too much but not knowing exactly what it is that you know, requires a different kind of thinking. I'm not antiquarian. As you see, I have my own thing, I carry it, I have Facebook, I have thousands of people waiting for me to say one thing or another, and so not being antiquarian and Gutenbergian, only my book, only my library, only my classroom, etc. I think is false and is wrong. We need to be the creature of the world that we are, but also an ability to be able to control it, to take back. I'm happy to, and I'll conclude with this, I'm happy to report that because I felt very behind, not knowing what was going on with Games of Thrones. Over the last month, my wife and I, every night we sit down and have a drink and watch what's happening to all of these dynasties and families in Games of Thrones. And initially we didn't quite follow who is killing what and what is happening, and so we correct our information. But now we're watching for a second time, so we are au courant and we can tell you everything you want to know about it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rauf, Ali, and especially Hamid. And thank you to the audience for attending, and I hope you've enjoyed the conversation as much as I have. I'd like to mention to you that our next speaker in this series will be Professor Russell Berman, the Walter A. Haas Professor in the Humanities at Stanford University, and that will be on Tuesday, December 2nd of this year. Dr. Berman will discuss the critical need to rethink the PhD in the humanities. And at this time, I'd like to invite everyone to the lobby for a reception and an opportunity to continue the conversation with Hamid Dabashi. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This was fun. It was great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.